Okay, so let's review the class up to now. So 3.6 billion years necessary for life to be here, where we share the planet with 8.7 to 8.9 million species. Many of these species on the last few decades are declining. Many of them are going extinct. We already came to learn that the reasons for that decline is a combination of proximal and ultimate drivers. Some of the proximal factors are things like habitat loss, overexploitation, and climate change, and invasive species. And the ultimate driver is us, people. As it comes down to people, however, there are different attributes of societies that made us to have different impacts on biodiversity. So that kind of summarizes the class up to now. Again, a lot of biospecies, many of them declining because of us. Now, we're going to be moving now to the third phase of this lecture, or this class, which is about understanding now what are societies, countries from around the world doing to protect that biodiversity, and how good are those strategies working. So we're going to start by focusing on the solutions that are being proposed to overexploitation. Okay, so we already know that we are causing the extinction of a species. One of the driving forces is overexploitation. How well are countries of the world reducing this issue of overexploitation? So let's summarize the problem again. So on the top of this thing, we have human societies, and there is an incredible complexity about who we are as a species. However, we require different things from nature, like household food and energy, and supplying those things is leading to deforestation, habitat loss, and overharvesting. And people, however, is trying to fix these problems, these proximal drivers, via a couple things mainly. One is protected areas, and the other one is regulation policies. So today we're going to be looking into regulation policies. Again, efforts that are done by countries from around the world that try to prevent overexploitation. So the overall principle of a regulation policy is this. Basically, it's the regulation of harvesting means to implement levels of extraction that preserve the economic value of a stock while ensuring sustainability. So again, if you were to just go and look around to how are countries from the world preventing overexploitation via the implementation of policies, this is generally speaking the protocol that is followed. Again, is to implement regulations that maintain the economic value of a stock while ensuring that the stock is fished or harvested sustainably. Here in this definition, I have indicated three important components to the success of these strategies. One is to implement, the other one is the economy, and the other one is sustainability. Every one of these components requires certain understanding for this strategy to be successful. Let's break down the different components, what is required for us to know that very well. Okay, so again, when it comes down to sustainability, again, whether we can fish or kill individuals from a species without causing the collapse of the species, it requires some scientific knowledge about that species. Can this species take the hit, so to speak? So what is that scientific knowledge entails? So the first one is that we need to understand what are the effects of harvesting on populations. We kind of saw that at the beginning of this class to figure out if we have populations that are control density dependent, normally harvesting has a negative effect that we summarize with what is called a fishing mortality. So here it is, the actual equation, just for you to remember it. So if you recall, this equation up to here is what is called density independent growth. That is, the population will just grow as a function of the growth rate. But scientists have also added this component, which includes carrying capacity, and that makes the population now to be regulated to carrying capacity. So if you were to model a population under those parameters, you will see that over time, the species then will grow to establish itself, to stabilize itself at what is called carrying capacity here, okay? Now, if you were to inverse them to analyze the growth rate as a function of the size, again, just kind of seeing as the population increases here, start moving beyond this point, how much is it growing, what you ended up having is this figure here. So as the population grows, basically when the population reaches half of the carrying capacity, then the population, the growth need to start being reduced, right? And the growth rate becomes zero when the population reaches carrying capacity. So at carrying capacity, the population doesn't grow anymore. And as you can see here, and about half the population size is where the growth rate is the maximum. So this kind of understanding, again, of comparing the growth rate as a function of the population size allows you to calculate what is called the maximum sustainable yield. Basically, what it suggests is that when a population reaches about this size, is where we can fish the most of that population. Basically, we can kill individuals there that will eventually die if we don't kill them, right? Because they will start killing themselves when they start getting closer to carrying capacity. So when the population passes halfway the carrying capacity, individuals will start dying because there are just too many of them and they will not grow well. So the idea here is that with this maximum sustainable yield is that once the population gets to the maximum, to that midpoint, then we can potentially start up to that point we can kill individuals that should eventually die. Again, that's what is called the maximum sustainable yield, and that's the maximum fish that we can take from a population without destroying the population. Now, the other piece of scientific knowledge that is required for that regulation of policy, for those policy regulations to be effective, is that we need to understand also what is the consequences of us fishing on the ecosystems. As we established before, it's not only about looking at the one species, but what is the consequences of us destroying that species on the entire ecosystem. And we introduced the example before, which is again what is called trophic cascades, which is again the fact that if we kill one species, like in this example, the sharks, killing that species is going to have ramifications in the ecosystem. So we need to understand this as well as part of the regulation policy, so that when we say, yeah, you can go and kill sharks, we need to understand that killing the sharks is not going to have broader consequences. So again, for those regulations to be effective, this is another piece of knowledge that we need to have. So we had established, again, two pieces of knowledge that are important. One is what is called the maximum sustainable yield, which is how much can we fish without causing the collapse of the species. The other one is what is the effect of fishing on the ecosystems. And the third piece of knowledge that we need to understand is also how are populations being affected by the environment. It's not only about us, the only driver that influences the size of the population. We also need to understand how does the environment plays into the size of the population, so that we just don't hammer those populations too hard. So if the environment is too harsh on those species, we just don't want to be adding more stress. So we also need to understand what are the consequences of that interaction between the environment and harvesting. Here is an example, for instance, of the required knowledge. This is a paper by Sarter. And basically what he chose here is that the chance of a species going extinct is commonly a function of how viable the environment is. So here in this line, the environment is very viable. And as you can see, it takes a very long time for the species to go extinct. Sorry, this is very viable. And you can see the species goes extinct super fast. And in here, where the environment is less viable, it normally takes a very long time for the species to go extinct. So the chances of a species going extinct when the environment is stable is a lot lower. So again, what I'm trying to point out here is that there is another piece of understanding that we need to have if we want these regulations that are put in place to be effective. If we are going to say to the people, you can only fish this many fish, we need to understand not only what are the consequences on the fish, what are the consequences on the ecosystem, but also what are the impacts of the environment on those populations, so that when we make these decisions, we are 100% certain that there are not going to be potential unintended consequences for the species or for the ecosystems. Another piece of knowledge that is required for these regulations to be effective is our economic understanding of what the regulation will do. That's something that I find pretty interesting here. Here is the figure that I just showed you here, looking at the growth rate of the population as a function of the population size. So given the population size, when it reaches about half the current capacity, you know that that's what is called maximum sustainable yield, okay? So again, that's the growth rate at which you can fish a population without causing the collapse. Now, if on top of this figure, you were to put fishing effort on the x-axis, and the cost of fishing on the y-axis, what you will find is that there is a direct relation, right? So basically what we're talking about here is that if you are going to go and fish a lot more, it's going to be a lot more expensive. When you take those two pieces of knowledge, again, the maximum sustainable yield with the economic cost of fishing, one of the things that you will find is what is called the maximum economic yield. Basically, it's this point here at which you get the most money, right? So at this moment, you can put this fishing effort, it's going to be very cheap, and that's where you are going to get the most fish. Here, you are going to fish, you are going to put a lot of fishing effort, but you are not going to get as much fish. On top of that, it's going to be more expensive. So you can actually, by having an understanding of the economic consequences of fishing, you can optimize the fishing, and sometimes it's counterintuitive because you can make the most money, not necessarily a maximum sustainable yield, but actually much lower levels of fishing. And that is actually a good thing for the species, because as you can see, you don't need to fish that high of a population. You don't have to deplete the population that much. What you can actually do is to fish at much lower levels, and you can make a lot more money. You will also allow the population to rebound a lot faster. So when you get this understanding of the economic consequences of fishing, you find out that actually there are much lower levels of fishing that are economically more profitable. With this understanding of the economic impacts of fishing, you also learn some of the detrimental effects of not having regulations in place. Basically, one of the things that happens and that has been discovered when you combine the biological data with the economical data is what is called a surplus profit. So in this area of the core, as far as there is more fish, the cost of the money that you get from the fisheries, which will be reflected on this blue line, is higher than the cost of fishing. You are going to be making money, right? As far as the cost is lower than fishing, than the fish that you catch, you are going to be making money, and that's what is called surplus profit. But it's not as much that you will get if you were to fish here, but there is still money to be made there. Unfortunately, when there are no regulations, what happens is that everybody wants to go and make money. So populations are fished at to this point, what is called zero surplus profit. Basically, at the moment when people put some money into fishing, they go and fish, they catch some fish, but unfortunately, the fish that they catch is just enough to pay the cost, and that's the reason why they don't make money at what is called zero surplus profit. Now, the problem again of letting fisheries to go and fish without any kind of regulation in place is that you see at this moment is when the populations are declining. Basically, again, is this issue of the fact that if the populations are not regulated based on the economic profit that you can get out of it, and the fact that the people is always about making money, will make the populations being fished up to these levels in which they are declining, because you can still make money at the moment when the populations are declining. That is obviously without having into account what we discussed earlier about the issue of subsidies or the value of rarity that will make actually fishing profitable even when the populations are declining quite a lot. So these are a piece of knowledge, again, that needs to be understood very well. What is the economic consequences of fishing if we are going to implement regulations that are effective? Now, the other interesting aspect of proposing effective regulation policies is what is called what I refer here as implementation. So it's not only about having good science and having a good understanding of the economic consequences of fishing so that you can propose good regulations. The governments also need to have a capacity to implement those regulations. Basically, what happens is this: you get the economic understanding, the impacts of fishing on the populations and ecosystems. You can put all of these things together to make a recommendation of this is how much fish you can catch from the oceans. But then what happens is that those regulations that we as scientists do go through this process that is called policy making, and they turn those recommendations that we as scientists give into regulations. And here is where things become interesting, because then it depends whether people is going to comply with those regulations or not. And that compliance can be achieved on two different ways. One is via compliance by itself, which is people that respect the law. And if you tell them you are going to fish only 5 kilograms, they go and fish only 5 kilograms. That's one way to do it, when people respect the laws. The other one is via enforcement, which is to tell you you are going to fish 5, but here is a police officer that is going to check that you actually fish 5. So again, for the policy regulation to be effective, you need to ensure that there is a mechanism for either to ensure that people will comply with the laws, or that there is a body in place that will ensure that enforcement. So this is, again, just to highlight the complexity that is there when we want to establish regulations to reduce overexploitation that are effective. And again, what I try to point out to this moment is that you need to have a scientific understanding what are the consequences of fishing on the populations, on the ecosystems, and the environment effect on those species. You also need to know the economic of this, and you need to understand that there is got to be in place something to ensure that people will comply via compliance of people directly or via enforcement. Unfortunately, the extent to which those different attributes are being followed by countries from around the world is unknown. There is not a single country in the world where we know where the regulations that they are putting in place are good or not to preserve the fisheries, as a case example. So back in 2009, I created this project to assess the global effectiveness of policy regulations. I wanted to analyze all of the countries in the world just to see how well are the countries in the world managing their fisheries. So again, fisheries is an important resource. We know that we are overexploiting them, and we know that countries are trying to preserve those fish. Well, what I tried to do on this paper with a group of colleagues of mine was to see how well is the countries of the world doing this. So for this one project, the Fisheries Management project, what I did was this. So there is a fishing effort on top, basically boats going on fishing. There is a scientific understanding that is required. As I explained to you, you need to understand what are the consequences of fishing on the fish, the populations, and all of that stuff. There gotta be a group of scientists studying what happens on those countries. Then there is a process of policy making that takes the recommendations by the scientists and turn that into regulations. Once the regulations are put in place, are used by bodies that ensures compliance, and how people comply with this will determine whether the fishery is sustainable or not. So basically what I try to do here is to document different aspects of the process that are required for you to regulate this fishing effort as to ensure that the fisheries of a country are sustainable. And we created a survey for every one of these attributes to find out how well are countries on the world. So all of these attributes were put in an internet survey, and basically what I did was to contact people from around the world and ask them to answer how well those different attributes of the fisheries of that country were. For this specific project, we interviewed 15,000 people. So I went through the internet, and for every country in the world that has an ocean front that is fishing, I went and collected data from the scientists, policymakers, and everyone who has worked on fisheries, and I put them into this database of 15,000 people, and I asked every one of those people to please answer some questions about how the different aspects of the fisheries process in that country were operating. Obviously, with that many people, there were several mistakes that were made, and I had to tell you that I learned a lot of geography on a project like that. And this is one of the interesting things from geography that I learned on that project. So when I was collecting this data of these scientists from around the world, mostly I was using books of congresses where people from around the world came to this congress, and sometimes they write their emails there, so that's where I was taking my information. But that didn't mean that all the people that came to this fisheries congress were people that work on the oceans. Obviously, sometimes I was emailing people that had nothing to do with fisheries to answer these questions, and most times they say, sorry, I just don't have an understanding of it. But this was one guy that thought I made a mistake because I was sending an email, and I asked this one person to please, that was from Slovakia, to please tell me how good was the management of their fisheries, of the marine fisheries on that country. But if you look at Slovakia, it doesn't have an ocean. So he thought that I was actually asking for Slovenia. So he sent me this image as part of the attachment on his email. And in his email, he says, Slovenia and Slovakia doomed to forever being mixed up. He was kind of making fun of me for me not knowing where Slovakia were, but the reality was that at that point, he was actually right. I just didn't know where that country was. But so you get to know a lot of geography with this project. Pretty much every single country in the world that has an ocean front, I managed to get data on how good the fisheries on that country were. So now let's look at the results of that survey. All right. So basically, I got the results of 15,000 people saying whether the fisheries of the country were good or not. For every single country, I put all of that data together on the different attributes that are required for you to have a successful fishing regulation. So let's break down the different attributes and what I found for the different countries. So these are the figures here. I had the different attributes that I analyzed: scientific, robustness, policy making, and I divided the results between countries that are rich in white and countries that are poor in black. Okay, so let's look at the first attribute of a good policy regulation, which is to have good science, right? So you need to have a group of scientists that are qualified and funded to go and get the data on how the fisheries are doing. So countries of the world are actually divided quite a lot between rich countries that are rich and countries that are poor. Countries that are rich, as you can see here, normally have better scientific robustness than countries that are poor. Right? Again, that makes sense. Developed countries can afford the money to pay scientists to go and collect data, and that's why most of the countries are actually that are rich have better scientific robustness than countries that are poor. Now, the next step in the process of making a policy is to take the scientific recommendations and turn them into policies via what is called policy making, and for that you require policy transparency. There gotta be a transparent process in which the scientific recommendations are turned into policies. Interestingly enough, there was no difference between rich and poor countries. The two type of countries were just as bad. Rich countries and poor countries were just as bad as taking that scientific recommendation and turning it into policies. Just as an example, say that the scientists say, you know what, these fisheries are declining too much. You can only fish 5 tons of fish. Somehow, at the end of the day, the policymakers say, no, you can go and fish 20 tons. So 4 times, at times, the scientific recommendations. So something was weird there on how the policymakers took the scientific recommendations to turn them into policies. And we discovered that policy transparency is kind of tinted in different ways on different countries. In rich countries, but let's start with the poor countries. In the poor countries, the factor that influenced that incapacity to take scientific recommendations into policies was corruption. So a lot of corruption in poor countries. Again, it's easy for a boat driver to go on and give money to a politician and say, hey, we gotta go and fish. So here is some money, just make the law pass for us to go and fish more. And that's how in developing countries, policies get implemented, again, mostly through corruption. Now, in the developed world, the United States and European countries, we found that the effect was the same in the sense that scientists were making recommendations, but the policies turned out to be completely different of what the scientists suggested. But the reason why that it happened in the developed world was because what is called a lobbying. So lobbying, in my opinion, is like legalized corruption. Because at the end of the day, what lobbying does is allow interest groups to go and modify the opinions of these politicians in a way that laws are moved in whatever direction the lobbying people want. Just like in the developing countries, laws are being pushed on the direction that the people that is paying, corrupting the politicians are. So again, policy transparency was just as bad in poor and rich countries. In poor countries because of corruption, in developed countries because of policy lobbying. And again, the consequence for the fish is the same. It's the fact that the science that is being done is not transferred correctly into policy making, again, because interest groups want different regulations in place. Now, when it comes down to implementing the regulations, again, you have the scientists make the recommendations, the policymakers make the law, but then you need to have these bodies in place that will ensure that the regulations that are created are implemented. And in this attribute, it turns out that developed countries are actually better than poor countries. Rich countries in whites, again, have better capacity to implement regulations. So if a law comes and says you only want to fish this much, there are bodies that ensure that those laws are followed. In developing countries or poor countries, that was not the case. There is just not a body capable of implementing this. That's the reason why in developed countries, it becomes fundamental to have a transparent policy, but unfortunately, it just doesn't happen. Fishing effort, I found it to be very interesting. Poor countries are actually fishing less than rich countries. The reason being that rich countries, of course, had a lot more money to go out and put more money into fishing. So most of the fishing in developing countries is small by comparison to developed, and it kind of makes sense. Subsidies, in this case, rich countries are the ones that are putting the most money into subsidies, different kind of reduction in taxes, actually giving subsidies to sustain people into these jobs that are economically not profitable. That was more common in rich countries than in poor countries. Poor governments never gave money to the fishermen to go and fish there. The final attribute that we analyzed was this access to foreign fishing. So again, there was a huge difference on the capacities of different governments to go and fish or not. Poor countries just don't have that money or that capacity to go and finance people to go and fish, right? So you will think that that will give a break to the fish in those countries, but it turns out that many of these countries are allowing international countries to come and fish in the water, and that to me was a massive discovery because I never thought that that was possible. It turns out that many countries had what is called international trading agreements. Basically what it is countries that had the money, had the fishing capacity, they cannot fish in their countries because it's highly regulated, so they make these agreements with developing countries to go and fish in their waters. And this is one of the discoveries on this paper. Like, for instance, the European Union had international fisheries agreements with 52 countries. So basically what they do is they have fishing boats from the European Union going to all of these countries and fishing there and sending the fish to the European Union. So the country that had the most international agreements were obviously the European Union. Second one was South Korea with 30 countries. South Korea has capacity to fish in 30 countries. Japan has the capacity to fish in 26 countries, China in 24. The United States had international agreements to fish in 18 countries. Now, these international agreements are seriously a disaster. Why? Well, the reason why countries, developing countries, are allowing other countries to come and fish is because they cannot fish. And the reason why they cannot fish is because they just don't have the money. So there is no enforcement, there is no oversight. So in turn, they are selling the capacity of other countries to come and fish to countries that have the money to even go there. So you can imagine what these boats are probably doing on many of these countries when an incredible amount of technology put into go and fish in places where there is simply no oversight. So it's a kind of an unfortunate situation. And the way that I saw this is like us taking the food out of the mouths of the poor people of the world. And again, because this is just the developed countries that can afford this, taking the food from the poor countries. There are several reports on this in which countries from the European Union go and fish in Africa. You can see the European Union fishing on most countries in Africa, countries where people is starving to death. So they go there, they fish, they take the fillet of the fish, and they leave the bones for the people in Africa to feed on. I mean, that is kind of sick to think about it. Totally illegal, by the way. So what we did on this project, we combined all of these attributes on how the process of fishing has to be done. Remember, to have a good fishing process, a good regulation of fisheries, you need to have a science, you need to have transparency policy, and you need to have the capacity to implement the regulation. All of these attributes we put together to generate an index that allows to see how well are the management of the fisheries of all of the countries in the world. That was my goal at the end. We know by species are being overexploited, many of them are collapsing, several of them are going extinct. We know that countries around the world are trying to prevent the loss of these species via the implementation of these policies. My goal in this project was to see how well our countries doing. What we found was this. So again, let's break it into the parts of the process. You need to start with the good science, right? So of all of the countries in the world, all of them, only 14 countries, which represent only 7% of all the countries in the world had good investment in science. So again, the fundamental part for you to create a good policy, which is having a good scientific understanding, is available in only 7% of all of the countries in the world. The second thing that we need for you to have a successful and effective regulation policy is to have a transparent policy making, such as the recommendations by scientists are transferred into good policies. It turns out that only 1.4% of the countries in the world had, in addition to good scientific understanding, transparent policies. Only 0.9% had the capacity to implement those regulations. Again, let me just break it again, just because just mind-blowing. Of all of the countries in the world, only 7% of them had to put money into getting good science to understand what the fishes are doing to the fish. Only 1.4% had the capacity to have a transparent policy making, and only of all of those countries, 0.9%, sorry, had the capacity to implement the regulations that are done by the policymakers. And there is seriously no one, zero. We're talking 0 country in the world that in addition doesn't have foreign fishing or subsidies or increased fishing capacity. So what we're talking about here is the fact that, okay, we had a mechanism which is called a policy regulation that will prevent a species of being overexploited, but the reality is that that process to be effective is not being done anywhere in the world. Again, there is not a single country in the world that can claim that they are doing an effective management of their fisheries. Even developed countries, which you will think that given the money that they had, they will be doing relatively well. But unfortunately, although they are putting a lot of money into good science and a good enforcement, it's that middle step of policy making in which they are being affected by lobbying people, interest groups that unfortunately make the regulations to be completely different of what the scientific recommendations were. And basically from there on, the entire process gets corrupted. So everything seems to be legal, but unfortunately in developed countries, they are enforcing laws that are not scientifically based, again, because we allow lobbying groups to influence policymaking in the developed world. The ultimate consequence of that is that all of the fisheries in the world are not well protected via regulation policies. Let's look at the countries of the world. So here in this map, I put all of the scores together and into that what is called the average management score. So in red are countries that are doing the worst, different attributes not doing so good, and in green are countries in which the majority of the attributes are doing okay. So let's look at the results. Obviously, Canada and the United States doing relatively well. All countries in the Caribbean and South America not doing so well. Africa was one of the worst countries, one of the worst continents when it comes down to the management of the fisheries. Obviously, the levels of poverty in those countries prevent them of having good science. There is just not enforcement. And to make matters worse, they are letting people from Europe to go and fish there. The Indian Ocean, just the same situation. Again, levels of poverty that prevents governments from those countries to invest on managing their fisheries. Australia doing relatively well, though. One of the countries that I feel they're the most proud there, because they should feel proud. Almost all of the attributes on the process of policy making being relatively strong there in Australia. And that right there is the management effectiveness of the world fisheries. Again, up to now, we have seen that biodiversity is being put under all of these stressors, and one of the solutions to prevent species of being overexploited, which is the regulation of policies. Unfortunately, what makes sense in paper and in theory, in practice, is just not working anywhere in the world. So let's summarize what is happening in the oceans. We already established that 70 to 80% of the fisheries in the world are being overexploited or fully exploited. We know that to preserve those fisheries, one of the strategies that is in place is having good management of the fisheries. That management of the fisheries, as I explained to you, require good scientific understanding. Unfortunately, only 7% of the countries had that good understanding. We also need countries that have transparent policy making, such that those recommendations by scientists are converted into laws. Unfortunately, only 1.2% of the countries in the world had transparent policy making. 0.9% had good enforcement, and basically there is not a single country that is not further affected by the effects of subsidies, foreign fishing, or excess fishing capacity. So what we are talking about again here is a beautiful asset, which is the fisheries of the world, 80% being overexploited, many of them declining, and while there is a regulation in place, again, the extent to which is successful globally is just not happening. And that summarizes one of the first strategies on how are we protecting the biodiversity of the world. Let's finish the class there for today.